Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might sound simple but was actually life-altering in the medieval world. Leaving your village for the first time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're a medieval peasant, 17 years old, standing at the edge of the only world you've ever known. Behind you, your village. A cluster of maybe 40 huts, a church, a mill, and fields stretching toward the forest. Ahead of you, a dirt path disappearing into trees you've only ever seen from a distance. This isn't excitement you're feeling, it's terror. Because in the Middle Ages, leaving your village wasn't an adventure. It was stepping off the edge of the known world into something vast, unknowable, and deeply, profoundly dangerous. For most medieval peasants, the village was the entire universe. You were born there. You'd die there. Your parents had been born there. Your grandparents too. Possibly everyone you'd ever met in your entire life had never travelled more than 5 miles from the spot where they first drew breath. The village wasn't just home. It was reality itself. Everything beyond it existed only in stories, rumours, and the occasional terrifying report from a travelling merchant who'd seen things you couldn't even imagine. The average medieval peasant lived their entire existence within a radius so small it would fit comfortably inside a modern shopping mall parking lot. Your world consisted of your hut, the fields you worked, the church where you prayed, the mill where you ground grain, and maybe the tavern where your father drank away his sorrows every Saturday night. That was it. That was the entire cosmos. The idea of travelling beyond this tiny bubble wasn't just unusual, it was almost unthinkable. You knew your village intimately, every stone, every tree, every muddy rut in every path. You knew which dogs barked, which chickens laid the most eggs, which neighbour complained the loudest about taxes. You knew the smell of the baker's oven at dawn, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer at noon, the sight of smoke rising from cottage hearths at dusk. These details weren't just familiar, they were the fabric of existence itself. They told you who you were, where you belonged, and what your life would be until the day you died and were buried in the churchyard next to everyone else who'd never left either. The world beyond your village existed in an abstract, almost mythical way. You'd heard of other places, the market town 2 days away, the cathedral city where the bishop lived, the castle where your lord resided when he wasn't touring his lands and making everyone's life miserable. London, if you lived in England. Paris, if you were in France. Rome, where the Pope supposedly lived in unimaginable splendour. But these places weren't real to you. They were more like characters in a story. You believed they existed the same way you believed in saints and demons. Theoretically, yes. But not in any way that affected your daily life of pulling turnips and avoiding dysentery. Maps didn't exist for people like you. Even if they had, you couldn't read. Most peasants were completely illiterate, unable to decipher even the simplest written words. Your knowledge of geography came entirely from stories told by travellers, and those stories were unreliable at best, complete fiction at worst. You'd heard that there were mountains somewhere that touched the sky, forests so deep that sunlight never reached the ground, cities with thousands of people all living on top of each other like ants, oceans that stretched to the edge of the world, but hearing about something and actually seeing it were two entirely different things. So when circumstances forced you to leave, when a lord demanded you deliver a message, or a family member in another village desperately needed help, or you were sent to a monastery, or conscripted for some back-breaking labour project, you didn't pack with excitement, you packed with dread. Because you were about to discover that the world was far larger, far stranger, and far more hostile than anything your small, muddy corner of existence had prepared you for. The decision to leave rarely came from you. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of wanderlust. Survival kept you rooted. Your family needed your labour. The fields required constant attention. The lord who owned your land wouldn't take kindly to you vanishing on some personal quest for enlightenment. Freedom of movement was not a concept medieval peasants understood. You belonged to the land, and the land belonged to your lord, and that was simply how the world worked. Leaving without permission could get you branded as a runaway, hunted down and punished severely. No, if you left, it was because someone with authority told you to leave, or because staying meant certain death. Maybe your father had arranged a marriage to someone in the next village over. Congratulations, you're about to walk 3 hours through unfamiliar terrain to live among strangers for the rest of your life. Or perhaps your lord required you to haul grain to a distant manor, a journey that would take several days and expose you to every danger the medieval countryside had to offer. Or the local priest decided you showed enough promise to be sent to a monastery for training. A rare honour that felt more like exile because monasteries were often located in remote, isolated places far from anything resembling civilization. Sometimes the reason was darker. Maybe your village was struck by plague, and someone needed to travel to the next town to beg for a priest to administer last rites. Maybe a relative had been arrested and was being held in a distant lord's dungeon, and your family sent you to plead for mercy or at least find out if they were still alive. Maybe famine had hit so hard that your family literally could not feed everyone, and you, being one of the younger or less essential members, were told to leave and try your luck elsewhere. Survive or don't. Either way, there was one less mouth to feed. Whatever the reason, the moment you realised you'd have to leave, panic set in. Not dramatic Hollywood panic, quiet, gnawing panic. The kind that sits in your stomach like a stone and whispers that you're making a terrible mistake. Because everyone knew the stories. People who left villages sometimes didn't come back. They got lost in forests, consumed by the endless maze of trees where every direction looked the same. They drowned in rivers while trying to cross at what looked like a shallow point but turned out to be a death trap. They were robbed by bandits who haunted the roads, waiting for lone travellers stupid enough to walk unprotected through their territory. They were mauled by wolves, bears, or wild boars. They fell ill from drinking bad water or eating the wrong berries, and died alone in a ditch with no one to bury them. Or they simply vanished as if the world beyond the village had swallowed them whole, leaving families to wonder forever what had happened. Your mother would weep when you told her, not because she was sentimental, but because she genuinely believed this might be the last time she'd see you. Medieval life was brutal and short, and death was always waiting just around the corner. Leaving the village meant multiplying the dangers tenfold. Your father would give you stern, unhelpful advice. Stay on the road, don't talk to strangers, avoid the woods at night, don't drink from stagnant water, keep moving, don't stop for anyone who looks suspicious, as if these instructions would somehow protect you from a world that was fundamentally unpredictable and frequently murderous. But they were the only advice he had, passed down from his father, who'd probably never left the village either, but had heard these same warnings from his father before him. The night before you left, you barely slept. You lay on your straw mattress, staring at the thatch roof, listening to your family breathe, and tried to memorize the sound of home. The crackle of the dying hearth fire, the rustling of chickens settling in their corner, the snoring of your father, a sound that usually annoyed you but now felt comforting. The soft breathing of your younger siblings piled together like puppies, the distant barking of a dog somewhere in the village, the wind moving through the thatch above your head. These were the sounds of safety, of familiarity, of everything you'd ever known. Tomorrow you'd be surrounded by silence, or worse, sounds you didn't recognize. Sounds that might signal danger, predators, hostile strangers, or simply the vast emptiness of a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. You thought about all the things that could go wrong. Getting lost was the most obvious fear. Without landmarks you recognized, without the ability to read signs that didn't exist anyway. How would you know if you were even going in the right direction? You'd heard stories of travellers who'd walked in circles for days, convinced they were making progress, only to stumble back to where they started, half dead from exhaustion and dehydration. Then there were the physical dangers. Wild animals, bandits, accidents. A twisted ankle could be a death sentence if you were alone on an empty road, with night falling and no shelter in sight. A sudden rainstorm could leave you soaked and shivering, vulnerable to the cold that killed more medieval travellers than any wolf ever did. But beyond the physical dangers was something harder to name. A psychological terror, the fear of being nobody, nowhere. In your village, you had an identity. You were someone's son, someone's brother, someone's neighbour. People knew your name, they knew your family, They knew your place in the social order. But out there, on the road, in strange villages where no one had ever heard of you or your family, you were nothing. Just another anonymous peasant, indistinguishable from thousands of others, with no status, no protection, and no reason for anyone to care if you disappeared. Packing was both simple and impossible. You owned almost nothing, so deciding what to bring took about 3 seconds. A spare tunic if you were lucky, though most peasants only owned one set of clothes total. The clothes you wore were the clothes you had, period. Maybe you could borrow a cloak from your father, something to keep the rain off and provide a bit of warmth at night. A chunk of hard bread baked specifically for the journey. Medieval travel bread was more weapon than food, baked until it was rock hard so it would last for days without moulding. You'd soften it by soaking it in water or beer when you stopped to eat, assuming you could find water or beer, which was never guaranteed. Maybe your mother gave you a water skin, a leather pouch that would hopefully hold enough water to get you between villages. It would leak, they always leaked, but it was better than nothing. A walking stick if you could find one sturdy enough, carved from a fallen branch and stripped of bark. The walking stick wasn't just for support, it was your only weapon, the only thing between you and whatever might attack you on the road. Not that a stick would do much against bandits with actual weapons or a hungry wolf, but it was better than facing the world completely defenceless. That was it. No maps, because you couldn't read, and maps for peasants didn't exist anyway. No compass, because those were rare, expensive, and reserved for sailors and nobles. No money, because you didn't have any. Medieval. Peasants rarely handled actual currency. Your economy was based on barter, labour, and produce. Coins were things you'd seen occasionally, usually when the tax collector came around to take what little your family had managed to scrape together. The idea of carrying money for a journey was laughable. You were travelling on hope, prayer, and the possibility that people along the way might show you mercy. No change of clothes, because you didn't own any. No food beyond that single piece of bread and maybe a chunk of hard cheese that smelled like it had been aging since the Crusades. No blanket, because blankets were valuable, and your family needed it more than you did. Just you, your threadbare tunic, your leaking water skin, your wooden stick, and a desperate hope that you wouldn't die before reaching your destination. Your mother handed you the food bundle with hands that shook slightly. She'd wrapped the bread and cheese in a piece of cloth, tied it carefully and pressed it into your hands like she was giving you a piece of her heart. She told you to eat sparingly, make it last, ration it carefully because you didn't know when you'd eat again. You nodded, knowing full well that by midday tomorrow you'd be so hungry you'd devour everything in one sitting, and spend the rest of the journey regretting it, and trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. She also gave you advice, the kind of advice mothers gave when they were terrified but trying to hide it. Don't trust strangers. Don't sleep in the open if you can avoid it. Keep your head down. Don't draw attention to yourself. If someone offers you food or shelter, be grateful but cautious. Not everyone who smiles is friendly. Some people smile while they're robbing you. And whatever you do, don't leave the road. People who wander off the road into the forest are never seen again. Your father added his own warnings. If you see armed men, hide. If you see a group of travellers, stay back and observe them before approaching. Lone travellers are targets. Groups of travellers might be safer, but they might also be bandits pretending to be ordinary people. Trust no one completely. Sleep lightly. Keep your walking stick close. And if you absolutely must fight, aim for the knees or the throat. Not that you'd ever been in a fight in your life, but now you had approximately 30 seconds of combat training from a man whose own fighting experience consisted of one drunken brawl at a village festival 15 years ago. The village gathered to see you off, not out of ceremony, but out of morbid curiosity. Leaving was unusual enough to be noteworthy. In a world where nothing ever changed, where every day was identical to the day before and the day before that, someone leaving was news. It was entertainment. It was gossip material for weeks. People wanted to see how you'd handle it, whether you'd cry, whether you'd turn back at the last second, whether you'd maintain your composure or break down, sobbing and have to be carried home in shame. Children stared at you like you were already a ghost. To them you might as well be. People who left were people who disappeared. They'd heard stories of relatives who'd gone away and never returned. Now you were becoming one of those stories. They watched with wide eyes, memorising your face so they could tell their own children someday about the person who left and never came back. Old women muttered prayers, crossing themselves and whispering to the saints for your protection. They'd seen enough people leave over the years. Some had returned, many hadn't. They knew the odds better than anyone, and the odds were not in your favour. Men shook their heads, silently communicating that you were probably doomed, but they admired your courage anyway. Or maybe they were just grateful it wasn't them making this journey, walking into uncertainty while they got to stay in the relative safety of the village. The priest appeared looking solemn and official. He blessed you, making the sign of the cross in the air and muttering a Latin prayer you didn't understand. Something about protection, probably. Something about God watching over travellers and keeping them from harm. You bowed your head respectfully, hoped the blessing would actually do something, and tried not to think about all the travellers throughout history who'd been blessed by priests and then died horribly anyway. And then there was nothing left to delay. The sun was rising. The day was beginning. It was time to go. You took a deep breath, adjusted the bundle on your back, gripped your walking stick, and turned toward the road. Your legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move, like your body was staging a quiet rebellion against your brain's decision to do this insane thing. But you made yourself take the first step, then another, then another. You walked past the last house, a small cottage where old widow Agnes lived with her 17 cats, past the edge of the fields where you'd worked since you were old enough to hold a tool, past the ancient oak tree where children played and lovers carved their initials and village meetings were sometimes held when the weather was nice, past the boundary marker, a pile of stones that had sat there for longer than anyone could remember, marking the edge of your world and the beginning of everything else. And just like that, you were outside, beyond the boundary, in the space that wasn't yours anymore. You glanced back once, saw your village shrinking behind you, saw the familiar buildings and the people and the fields all getting smaller and smaller, until they were just shapes, and then just smudges, and then nothing at all. And you realised with cold, creeping certainty that you were now more alone than you'd ever been in your entire life. The road, if you could even call it that, was barely distinguishable from the surrounding dirt. Medieval roads weren't paved, at least not the roads peasants used. The Roman roads, those magnificent stone highways that had once connected an empire, were still around in some places, but they were for important people travelling on important business. Peasants used dirt paths, trails carved into the earth by centuries of feet, hooves and wagon wheels, all churning the ground into an uneven, rutted mess that turned into an impassable swamp every time it rained. And it rained a lot in medieval Europe, constantly, as if God himself was determined to make travel as miserable as possible. Walking on a medieval road meant constantly watching your footing. The surface was treacherous, full of holes, rocks, roots and hidden mud pits that could swallow your foot up to the ankle. One wrong step and your ankle twisted, leaving you crippled and helpless on an empty road with no one to help you. Another wrong step and you plunged knee-deep into a hidden puddle that smelled suspiciously like something had died in it, possibly multiple somethings, possibly, recently. Your shoes, if you even had shoes, were useless against this terrain. Most peasants wore simple leather wrappings or wooden clogs that offered minimal protection, and even less comfort. After a few hours of walking, your feet would be blistered, bleeding and screaming at you to stop. But stopping wasn't an option. You had to keep moving. There were no signs, no mile markers, no helpful arrows pointing toward the next village, or indicating how far you'd come or how far you still had to go. Just an endless, winding trail that occasionally split into 2 or 3 directions, leaving you to guess which one wouldn't lead you into a bog, a dead end, or straight into a bear's den. Sometimes there were crossroads, places where multiple paths intersected, and you had to make a choice based on nothing but instinct, guesswork, and prayer. Choose right, and you'd eventually reach your destination. Choose wrong, and you could add hours or even days to your journey, assuming you didn't. Get completely lost and wander until you starved. You walked for hours. The sun climbed higher, turning the morning chill into midday heat, and with every step the world grew stranger. Trees you didn't recognize, species that didn't grow near your village, birds with calls you'd never heard, strange warbling songs that sounded almost human and made the hair on your neck stand up. The sky looked different somehow, bigger, more vast, as if it had been compressed over your village and was now expanding to its full, overwhelming size. Even the air smelled different. Less like home, less like the familiar combination of wood smoke, animal dung, and unwashed humans. More like something foreign, something wild, something vaguely threatening in its unfamiliarity. You passed fields that looked like your fields, but they weren't your fields. They belonged to someone else, someone you didn't know, someone who owed allegiance to a different lord in a different manner with a different set of arbitrary rules. The boundaries were invisible to you, but they existed nonetheless. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of tiny jurisdictions, each with its own customs, laws, and lordship. Cross from one manor to another, and everything changed. What was legal on one side of an unmarked boundary might be a crime on the other side. Not that you'd know until you were arrested, tried, and punished. The fields were being worked by peasants just like you. Men and women bent over crops, moving with the slow, exhausted rhythm of people who'd been labouring since dawn and would continue until dusk. You wanted to wave, to shout a greeting, to confirm that you weren't the only human left in existence. But you didn't. Because what if they were hostile? What if they thought you were a thief, a runaway, or worse? What if they reported you to their lord as a suspicious stranger, and suddenly you were being dragged before some minor nobleman who decided you looked guilty of something and threw you in a dungeon just because he could? So you kept walking, eyes forward, trying to look purposeful and non-threatening at the same time, trying to project the image of someone who had every right to be on this road, someone with legitimate business, someone not worth bothering. It was a delicate balance. Look too confident and you seemed suspicious. Look too nervous and you seemed guilty. Look too weak and you became a target. Medieval travel was as much about managing perceptions as it was about covering distance. The sun continued its arc across the sky. Your shadow shortened, then lengthened. Your legs began to ache, a dull throb that started in your feet and worked its way up through your calves, your thighs, your hips, your back. Your shoulders hurt from the way you were carrying your bundle. Your hand cramped from gripping the walking stick. Your mouth grew dry, your lips cracked, your tongue felt like a piece of old leather. Sweat soaked through your tunic, then dried, then soaked, through again, leaving you sticky and uncomfortable and smelling like a wet goat. Hunger arrived right on schedule. By midday your stomach was growling so loudly you worried it might attract wolves. The joke wasn't even funny, but you thought it anyway because your mind was starting to wander, losing focus, drifting into strange thoughts and half-remembered songs and a growing obsession with food. You pulled out your bundle of provisions, sat on a rock that may or may not have been someone's grave marker, and carefully unwrapped the bread and cheese. The bread was exactly as terrible as you'd expected. Hard as stone, dense as a brick, and tasting like someone had ground up sawdust and dirt, and then baked it into a shape vaguely resembling food. But it was food, and food was life. So you chewed grimly, working your jaw until your teeth hurt, until the bread finally began to soften, until you could swallow it without choking. The cheese was better, tangy and sharp, though it smelled so. Strongly, you half expected it to walk away on its own. You ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to fool your stomach into thinking it was getting more than it actually was. You washed it down with water from your leaking water skin. The water tasted stale and slightly off, like it had been sitting in leather too long, picking up flavours you didn't want to think about. But it was wet, and wet was what you needed, so you drank, trying not to gulp, trying to conserve because you didn't know when you'd find more. After eating, you sat for a few more minutes, resting your feet, trying to convince yourself that you could stand up and keep walking. Your body wanted to stay on this rock forever. Your mind knew that staying meant falling behind schedule, missing your destination, potentially sleeping on the road with no shelter. So you stood, groaning like an old man even though you were barely past childhood, and continued walking. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Time seemed to move, differently on the road. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. You tried counting steps to pass the time. You made it to 300 before losing track and giving up. You tried reciting prayers, the ones you'd learned in church, the familiar Latin words you didn't understand but had memorized through repetition. You tried singing, but your voice came out cracked and thin, and the sound of it in the emptiness around you was so lonely and pathetic that you stopped. Thirst was worse than hunger. Your water skin, as predicted, had leaked steadily throughout the day. Now you had maybe a few mouthfuls left, and the road offered no convenient streams or wells. You passed a puddle, a muddy depression filled with brownish water, and genuinely considered drinking from it. You stared at that puddle for a long moment, weighing the risk. Then you remembered every warning you'd ever heard about bad water, how it could twist your guts into knots, how people died from drinking the wrong puddle, how dysentery could kill you in days. So you moved on, mouth dry as dust, throat burning, hoping you'd find something safe before dehydration turned you into a historical statistic. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion set in properly. The kind of exhaustion that makes every step feel like climbing a mountain. Your feet hurt so badly you could feel every blister, every raw spot where skin had rubbed away. Your legs ached with a deep, bone-tired pain that made you want to lie down in the middle of the road and never get up. Your back felt like someone had been using it as a chopping block, every vertebra screaming in protest. Medieval peasants were used to hard labour. You'd spent your whole life working in fields, hauling water, chopping wood, doing back-breaking tasks from dawn to dusk. But walking for hours on uneven terrain while carrying even a small pack was a different kind of torture. It used muscles you didn't normally use. It required a sustained effort, that field work didn't. You could rest during field work, straighten your back, catch your breath. On the road, you couldn't rest. You had to keep moving. Every hour you stopped was an hour wasted, an hour that might mean the difference between reaching shelter before dark and spending the night in a ditch. You started talking to yourself, not because you were losing your mind, though that was debatable, but because the silence was oppressive. The world around you was so quiet it felt unnatural. No voices, no familiar sounds, just the crunch of your footsteps, the rustle of wind through grass, the occasional bird cry. The silence pressed on you, made you feel small and insignificant and alone. So you muttered to yourself, just to hear a human voice, even if it was your own. You recited prayers, the same ones you'd tried earlier, but this time more desperately. You talked to your mother, imagining what she'd say if she could see you now. Probably something about keeping your chin up and not complaining. You recited fragments of songs your family sang during harvest time. You counted your steps again, lost count again, started over again. You made deals with God. Just get me to the next village, and I'll be good forever. I'll never complain. I'll attend every mass. I'll be kind to everyone. Just please, please, let there be a village soon. Anything to fill the void. Anything to convince yourself you were still real, still moving, still alive, still capable of reaching your destination. The mind does strange things in isolation and exhaustion. You started seeing things that weren't there. Shapes in the distance that might be buildings but turned out to be trees. Movements at the edge of your vision that might be people but turned out to be shadows. You kept expecting to round a corner and see something familiar, some landmark that would tell you where you were and how much farther you had to go. But everything looked the same. Trees, fields, sky, road. Endless, monotonous, crushing in its sameness. And then finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if you weren't too exhausted to care, you saw it. Smoke rising in the distance, thin columns of grey smoke drifting up from what had to be hearth fires. Your heart leaped, suddenly pounding with a mixture of relief and hope so intense it made you dizzy. Smoke meant people. People meant shelter, food, maybe even safety. You quickened your pace, ignoring the protest from your blistered feet, ignoring the pain in your legs, ignoring everything except that smoke. You moved faster, faster than you'd moved all day, drawn toward those thin grey columns like a moth to flame. As you got closer, shapes emerged from the landscape. Buildings, a cluster of huts, small and dark against the darkening sky. Wooden walls, thatched roofs, a narrow dirt lane running between them, another village, smaller than yours maybe, but definitely human habitation, definitely somewhere with living people who might, if you were very lucky, allow you to survive the night. Relief flooded through you, so powerful it almost knocked you over. You'd made it. You weren't lost. You weren't dead. You were somewhere, and that somewhere had other humans in it. but relief was quickly replaced by a new anxiety, one you hadn't fully considered until this moment. These weren't your people. This wasn't your village. You had no idea how they'd react to a stranger showing up at dusk, exhausted, filthy, and probably smelling like a combination of sweat, mud, and desperation. Approaching a strange village in the Middle Ages was like approaching a wolf den while covered in meat. You had to be careful, deliberate, non-threatening. Medieval villages were insular, suspicious, and deeply protective of their limited resources. A stranger meant potential trouble. Maybe you were a thief, scouting the village for something to steal. Maybe you carried disease, plague, or some other pestilence that could wipe out half the population. Maybe you were a spy for a rival lord, gathering information. Maybe you were a criminal running from justice. Or maybe you were just a desperate traveller. But how were they supposed to know the difference? They couldn't. So they defaulted to suspicion, mistrust, and a readiness to defend what little they had. You slowed your pace as you reached the village edge, trying to look harmless. Not too confident, because that suggested you might be dangerous. Not too weak, because that suggested you might be pathetic and worthless. Just neutral, forgettable. Someone passing through who wouldn't cause problems. You kept your hands visible, kept your walking stick low and non-threatening, kept your eyes down in a posture of submission and respect. A few villagers noticed you immediately. They always did. In a world where nothing ever happened, a stranger was instant entertainment, instant news, instant gossip. A woman carrying a bucket of water from the well paused mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she studied you. She didn't smile, she didn't wave. She just watched, calculating, trying to determine what kind of threat you might represent. A man sharpening a tool on a whetstone straightened up, his hand moving casually but deliberately to rest on the handle of something that could be used as a weapon if necessary. A knife, probably. Or maybe a small hatchet. Medieval peasants didn't carry swords, but they all had tools that could kill you if they decided you needed killing. Children stopped their playing to stare. Their faces were smudged with dirt, their clothes ragged, their expressions curious but cautious. They'd been taught, probably from the moment they could walk, that strangers were dangerous. Don't talk to them. Don't get close to them. Don't trust them. So they stood at a safe distance and watched you like you were an exotic animal that might bite. You raised a hand in greeting, the universal gesture for "please don't attack me, I'm just passing through, I mean no harm. I'm more scared of you than you are of me." No one returned the gesture, they just stared, silent, calculating, deciding whether you were worth the effort of hospitality or whether it was easier to let you keep walking into the growing darkness and become some other village's problem. The silence stretched uncomfortably. You could feel them judging you, evaluating every aspect of your appearance, your clothes worn and dirty from travel, your face probably sunburned and exhausted, your posture hunched from carrying your bundle, your feet almost certainly bleeding inside your shoes. You were a walking testament to the misery of medieval travel, and they could see all of it. They knew exactly what you were, a desperate stranger with nowhere to go and no one to protect you. Finally, someone spoke. Usually an older man, someone with enough authority to ask questions, someone the other. Villagers looked to for decisions. He stepped forward, still keeping a safe distance, still keeping his hand near his belt where a knife probably hung. "Where are you from?" His tone wasn't friendly, but it wasn't openly hostile either. Just cautious, suspicious, with an undertone of, "Give me one reason not to run you out of here immediately." You told him the name of your village. He nodded slowly, as if trying to remember whether he'd heard of it. He probably hadn't. Medieval geography was a confusing mess of tiny unnamed settlements that only locals knew existed. Villages didn't have official names half the time. They were just the village to the people who lived there. To outsiders, they were that place past the oak grove, or the settlement near the river bend, or somewhere I think I've heard of, maybe. "What's your business?" he asked next. This was the important question, the one your answer would determine everything. If you had a legitimate reason for travelling, you might be tolerated. If you seemed like a drifter, a beggar, or someone fleeing trouble, well, good luck convincing them to let you stay. Medieval villages had no resources to spare on random strangers. Charity existed, yes, but it was reserved for locals, for people you knew, for members of your own community. Outsiders got suspicion and hostility. You explained your purpose as simply and respectfully as possible. Maybe you were delivering a message for your lord. Maybe you were visiting a relative who lived 2 villages away. Maybe you'd been sent to a monastery for training. Maybe you were fulfilling some obligation, some duty that forced you to be on this road. Whatever it was, you made sure it sounded official, unavoidable, and temporary. You weren't here to stay. You weren't here to beg. You weren't here to cause trouble. You were just passing through. You'd be gone by dawn. You'd require minimal resources, and you'd be grateful for any scrap of mercy they could spare. The man considered this. His eyes moved over you again, reassessing. Then he glanced at the others, a silent conversation happening in gestures and expressions you couldn't quite read. The woman with the bucket tilted her head slightly. Another man shrugged. An old woman standing in a doorway crossed her arms and frowned, but didn't object. Finally the spokesman grunted, a sound that might have been agreement or might have been resignation. You can stay the night, but you leave at first light. No trouble, no stealing. You understand? You nodded quickly, emphatically, grateful and terrified in equal measure. Yes. Thank you. I understand. I'll cause no trouble. I promise. Thank you. You probably said thank you too many times, but you couldn't help it. Relief was making you babble. He pointed toward the far edge of the village, toward a structure that might have been a barn or might have been something even less welcoming. There. You can sleep there. Don't come near the houses, don't bother. Anyone. There's a well in the centre if you need water. That's it. Dawn comes, you leave. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest pretense of hospitality. You were being allowed to exist in their space for one night, nothing more. They'd keep an eye on you, make sure you didn't steal anything or murder anyone in your sleep, and then eject you at first light like an 2 or 4 p.m. unpleasant bit of refuse. But it was better than sleeping on the open road. It was better than being run out of town immediately. It was survival, barely, but survival nonetheless. You thanked him again, bowed slightly in a gesture of respect and submission, and made your way toward the structure he'd indicated. As you walked, you felt eyes on you. Everyone in the village was watching, tracking your movement, making sure you went exactly where you'd been told to go and nowhere else. You kept your head down, your movements slow and non-threatening, trying to project harmlessness with every step. The barn, or whatever it was, loomed ahead. Wooden walls that had seen better days, gaps between the planks wide enough to see through, a roof that probably leaked in at least a dozen places. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and when you pushed it open it groaned like a dying animal. Inside it smelled like animals, dung and damp straw, a pungent organic smell that made your eyes water but wasn't entirely unpleasant. It smelled like life, like the barnyard back home, like something familiar in this world of unfamiliarity. There were no animals inside currently, which was a small blessing. Just scattered piles of straw, some old tools leaning against the walls, and enough dim light filtering through the gaps to see where you were going. You found a corner that looked relatively clean, or at least less filthy than the other corners, and spread out your cloak. The straw underneath was damp and probably full of insects, but it was softer than sleeping on bare ground, so you counted it as a win. You sat down slowly, your body practically screaming with relief at no longer being vertical. Your legs felt like they might never work again. Your feet throbbed with a deep burning pain that suggested you'd done some serious damage to them. You carefully removed your shoes, or whatever passed for shoes, and examined your feet. Blisters. Multiple blisters. Some intact, some burst and oozing. Raw patches where skin had rubbed completely away. Swelling. Dirt crusted into every crack and crevice. Your feet looked like they'd been through a war, which, in a way, they had. Medieval travel was warfare against your own body, and your feet were the front line. You had nothing to treat them with. No bandages, no salve, no medicine. So you just sat there, letting them breathe, hoping that rest and time would be enough to get you moving again tomorrow. The thought of walking on these feet for another full day made you want to cry, but crying wouldn't help. It never did. You ate the rest of your bread and your onion, chewing slowly, trying to make the meagre meal last as long as possible. The onion was sharp and strong, making your eyes water, but it had substance. It had flavour. It reminded you that you were still alive and still capable of tasting things. A few chickens wandered into the barn, clucking softly, utterly indifferent to your existence. One of them came close, pecking at the ground near your feet, and you watched it with a kind of detached fascination. This chicken had probably never travelled more than a few dozen yards from this barn. It had never known fear of the unknown, never experienced the terror of leaving home. Lucky chicken. Somewhere outside you heard voices, the villagers settling into their evening routines, laughter drifting from one of the huts, a dog barking in the distance, a mother calling her children inside, the sounds of a community, a functioning social unit, people who belong to each other and to this place. Its ears should have been comforting. Instead, it reminded you just how far from home you really were. You weren't part of this community. You were an outsider, an intruder, tolerated for one night, and then expected to vanish. You tried to sleep but couldn't. Your mind was too active, racing through the day's events, replaying every moment of fear and exhaustion. You thought about your family, wondered what they were doing right now, probably sitting around the hearth, talking quietly, maybe saying a prayer for your safety. Your mother was probably crying. She'd cried when you left, and you'd bet she was still crying now. Your father was probably trying to stay strong, telling everyone you'd be fine. You were smart and capable. You'd make it to your destination and back with no problems. But you knew he was worried too. Everyone was worried. Every sound made you flinch. Every creak of wood, every rustle of straw, every distant shout from the village. You weren't used to sleeping alone, in a strange place, surrounded by potential threats. Back home, you slept next to family, surrounded by familiar sounds and familiar people. Here, you were on your own, vulnerable. If something happened, if someone decided to rob you or harm you, or simply investigate the stranger in their barn, you'd have no defense, no protection, no one to call for help. Eventually, exhaustion won. Your body simply gave up, shut down, and dragged you into a shallow, uneasy sleep. You dreamed of roads that never ended, of walking forever through landscapes that shifted and changed, of reaching for home only to have it dissolve like smoke every time you got close. You dreamed of being lost, truly lost, wandering in circles until you forgot where you'd come from and where you were trying to go. You dreamed of a voice calling your name from somewhere far away, a voice you recognized but couldn't place, and you kept trying to reach it but couldn't find the source. When you woke, it was still dark, not dawn. Yet, just the deep, thick darkness of the middle of the night. You lay there, disoriented, trying to remember where you were. The smell reminded you. Barn. Strange village. First night away from home. You were cold, shivering despite your cloak. The temperature had dropped, and your damp clothes weren't providing much protection. You curled into a tighter ball, trying to conserve warmth. Trying to steal a few more hours of rest before dawn forced you back onto the road. But sleep wouldn't return. You just lay there, staring at nothing, listening to the night sounds of a village you didn't belong to, counting the hours until sunrise and wondering how many more days of this you could possibly endure. Morning arrived too soon and too cold. Grey light filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, announcing dawn without enthusiasm. You woke stiff, sore, and covered in straw that had worked its way into every crevice of your clothing, your hair, even somehow inside your shoes. You ached, everywhere. Muscles you didn't know you had were announcing their existence through screaming pain. Your feet, if anything, felt worse than they had last night. Swollen, tender, barely able to fit back into your shoes. Outside, the village was already stirring. You heard voices, the clatter of tools, the bleating of goats being let out of their pens. Medieval peasants rose with the sun. They had to. Daylight was precious, not to be wasted. Work began at dawn and continued until dusk, with only brief pauses for meals and prayer. You gathered your things slowly, wincing with every movement and prepared to leave. No one offered you breakfast. No one said goodbye. No one even acknowledged your presence as you emerged from the barn and began walking toward the far edge of the village. A few people glanced at you, their expressions neutral, already forgetting you existed. You'd been a momentary curiosity, nothing more. Now you were just a problem solving itself by leaving. You nodded, politely to anyone who made eye contact. No one nodded back. Medieval hospitality had its limits, and you'd reached them. You kept walking, retracing your steps to where you thought the road was, hoping you'd chosen the right direction, hoping you wouldn't somehow end up walking in circles and arriving back at this same village by accident. By the time you reached the village edge, you were alone again, the cluster of huts already receding behind you. The road stretched ahead, empty and unwelcoming, and you realised with sinking despair that this was only day 2. You still had so much farther to go. Day 2 of travelling was worse than day 1 in every conceivable way. Your body hadn't recovered from yesterday's abuse. If anything, it had hardened overnight into a rigid, painful mass that resisted every movement. Your muscles ached with that deep, bone-tired pain that comes from over-exertion and insufficient rest. Your feet, those poor, abused feet, screamed with every step. The blisters from yesterday had multiplied, creating new ones on top of old ones, turning your feet into raw, bleeding messes wrapped in inadequate shoes. And the novelty of travel, if there had ever been any, was completely gone. Now it was just pain, monotony, and the creeping realization that you still had so much farther to go. Miles and miles and miles, days and days and days, an endless succession of putting one foot in front of the other while your body begged you to stop and your mind whispered that you'd made a terrible mistake. The landscape shifted subtly as you walked. Forest grew thicker, their trees pressing closer to the road, creating shadows that felt oppressive even in daylight. Hills appeared where the land had been relatively flat, forcing you to climb steep inclines that left you gasping, and then descend the other side trying not to slip and fall. The road, never particularly good, grew even worse. Rockier, more uneven, with sections that seemed to have been completely washed out by rain, leaving gaps you had to carefully navigate. You passed a river, wide and fast-moving, its water brown with churned-up mud from upstream. You realised with sinking dread that you'd have to cross it. And of course there was no bridge. Why would there be a bridge? Bridges were expensive. Bridges required maintenance. Bridges were for important roads and wealthy regions. You were on a peasant's path. You'd have to wade. You stood at the riverbank staring at the water, trying to judge its depth. It didn't look deep, but appearances meant nothing. Medieval rivers were treacherous, deceptive, deadly. They had drowned plenty of people who'd made the same calculation you were making right now. It doesn't look that deep. Famous last words of countless medieval travellers whose bodies were found downstream days later, if they were found at all. But you had no choice. The river was in your way. Your destination was on the other side, so you'd have to cross or give. Up entirely and go home in shame. You took a deep breath, gripped your walking stick, made sure your bundle was secured as tightly as possible, and stepped into the water. The cold hit you immediately, a shock that made you gasp and nearly made you turn back. The water was ice cold, fed by mountain streams or underground springs, and it felt like it was reaching through your clothes and skin to freeze your bones. The current tugged at your legs, stronger than you'd expected, trying to pull you off balance, trying to sweep you downstream. You moved slowly, carefully, testing each step before committing your weight. The riverbed was uneven, covered in slippery rocks that shifted under your feet. One wrong step and you'd go down, get swept away, drown in muddy water while your village never even knew what happened to you. You gripped your walking stick so hard your knuckles went white, using it to brace yourself against the current, probing ahead for holes or drop-offs. Halfway across, the water reached your thighs, soaking your clothes completely, pulling you with increasing insistence downstream. You stumbled, caught yourself, heart pounding so hard you thought it might break through your ribs. One step, another, each one a victory, each one bringing you closer to the opposite bank. Your teeth chattered, your legs felt numb. The bundle on your back grew heavier as water soaked into the cloth. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, you reached the opposite bank. You hauled yourself out, scrambling up the muddy slope, and collapsed on solid ground, dripping and shivering. Your clothes clung to your skin, heavy and cold, pulling you down like they were trying to drag you back into the river. You were freezing, actually genuinely freezing. You could feel your body temperature dropping, your muscles starting to seize up, your thoughts becoming fuzzy and slow. You had no way to dry yourself. No fire, no spare clothes, no shelter. The sun was up, but it was weak, offering minimal warmth. You wrung out your tunic as best you could, squeezed water from the hem, tried to twist your cloak to remove some of the moisture, but you were still soaked, and you had to keep walking. Staying still meant getting colder, and getting colder meant dying. Hypothermia killed quickly, especially when you were already exhausted and underfed. So you walked, each step squishing water from your shoes, each movement reminding you just how cold and miserable you were. You walked and hoped that the exercise would warm you, that your body heat would eventually dry your clothes, that you wouldn't die on the side of the road from something as stupid as getting wet. By midday, you were slightly drier but no less miserable. The morning's exertion had warmed you enough to stop the shivering, but your clothes were still damp, chafing against your skin, making every step uncomfortable. And then there was the new problem. You were lost. Not dramatically lost. Not, I'll never find my way home lost. Just uncertain. The road had split into 3 paths maybe an hour ago, and you'd had to make a choice. You'd chosen the middle path, not because it seemed right, but because it seemed least wrong. And now, walking along this trail, you had no idea if you'd chosen correctly. There were no landmarks you recognised, no signs, no way to tell if you were heading toward your destination, or away from it, or in some completely random direction that would leave you wandering until you died of exposure or starvation. Panic crept in, slow and cold. What if you were wrong? What if you'd added days to your journey? What if you never reached your destination at all? What if you wandered off into some remote corner of the countryside and your bones were found years later by a shepherd who wondered who you'd been and why you'd died alone? You kept walking because there was nothing else to do. Turning back felt wrong. Standing still accomplished nothing. Forward was the only option, even if forward might be taking you nowhere. You prayed, silently, desperately, bargaining with God and every saint you could name. Please let this be the right path. Please let me reach somewhere safe. Please don't let me die out here alone. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, marking time you couldn't afford to waste. Your stomach reminded you, loudly and persistently, that you'd eaten the last of your food yesterday. Hunger wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was a gnawing, consuming presence that made it hard to think about anything else. Your body was running on empty, burning through whatever reserves it had left, and those reserves were never particularly full to begin with. You scanned the roadside desperately for anything edible. Berries growing on bushes, roots you could dig up, mushrooms, though mushrooms were terrifying because half of them were edible, and half of them would kill you, and unless you really knew what you were doing, it was impossible to tell the difference. You saw berries, small and dark, growing on a bush near the road. You stopped, stared at them, tried to remember if anyone had ever told you whether these particular berries were safe. You couldn't remember. Your mind was foggy from hunger, exhaustion, and stress. The berries looked harmless. They looked like food. Your stomach cramped painfully, reminding you that you needed to eat something soon. But eating the wrong thing could be worse than eating nothing. You'd heard stories of people who'd eaten poisonous berries and died in agony, vomiting and convulsing while their families watched helplessly. You moved on, leaving the berries untouched, stomach growling in protest. Better hungry than dead. That was the medieval motto. Better suffering than making things worse by making stupid choices. As evening approached, you saw smoke again. Another village. Or maybe the same village you'd left that morning. At this point, you genuinely couldn't tell. Medieval villages all looked the same. Same huts, same layout, same suspicious people. But smoke meant people, and people meant the possibility of food, shelter, mercy. So you headed toward it, each step heavier than the last, your body barely functioning, running on nothing but stubborn determination, and the increasingly faint hope that you might actually survive this journey. This village was smaller than the last. Maybe 20 huts, a single well in the centre, and a church so tiny it looked like it might blow over in a strong wind. You approached slowly, rehearsing the same speech you'd given yesterday, preparing for the same questions, the same suspicion, the same grudging, minimal tolerance. The villagers noticed you immediately. Of course they did. An old man looked up from sharpening a tool. A woman carrying a bundle of firewood paused. Children playing some game with sticks and stones stopped to stare. You raised your hand in greeting, trying to smile, trying to look harmless and pitiable at the same time. Where are you from? Same question. Different man asking it, but the same cautious, suspicious tone. You told him. He frowned, clearly not recognizing the name. Where are you going? You explained. A monastery. 2 days away. Maybe 3. You were delivering a message, fulfilling a duty, just passing through. No trouble, no problems, just a traveller who needed to survive the night. The man studied you for a long moment. Then he turned to the woman with the firewood and said something you couldn't hear. She shrugged. He turned back to you. There's a barn near the edge. You can stay there, but we have no food to spare. You understand? You nodded quickly. Yes, I understand. Thank you. No food. Of course, no food. Medieval villagers lived on the edge of survival themselves. They had barely enough to feed their own families. A stranger was a burden they couldn't afford. You should have expected this. You did expect this. But the disappointment still hit hard. You made your way to the barn, a structure even more decrepit than the last one. You found a corner, spread your damp cloak and sat down heavily. Your entire body felt like it was shutting down. Your feet throbbed. Your legs trembled. Your stomach cramped with hunger so intense it made you nauseous. And then something unexpected happened. One of the villagers appeared in the doorway. An older woman, her face weathered and lined, her back bent from a lifetime of labour. She looked at you for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped forward and held out something wrapped in cloth. Here, she said simply. You took it, hands shaking, and unwrapped it. Bread. A small piece, barely a meal, but more than you had. You looked up at her, eyes welling with tears you hadn't realised were there. Thank you, you whispered. Thank you so much. She waved you away, embarrassed by your gratitude. It's just bread, don't make a fuss. And she turned and left before you could say anything more. You sat there, holding that small piece of bread like it was the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, it was. You ate it slowly, savouring every crumb, feeling strength return to your body in tiny increments. It wasn't much, it wouldn't last. But it was enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to survive one more day. That night you slept a little easier. Not because the barn was comfortable, it wasn't. Not because you felt safe, you didn't. But because you'd learned something important. Even in a world that was harsh and suspicious and cruel, there were still moments of kindness. Small, unexpected mercies that reminded you that humanity hadn't been completely ground out of existence by medieval life. By the 3rd day, you'd developed a rhythm born of necessity and desperation. Wake at dawn, stiff and cold. Stand up, ignoring the protests from every muscle and joint. Start walking. Walk until your legs threaten to give. Out. Rest briefly. Walk again. Keep walking until nightfall. Find shelter. Any shelter. Even if it's just a tree to sleep under. Close your eyes. Try to sleep despite the fear, the hunger, the pain. Wake up and repeat. It wasn't living, it was barely surviving. But survival was all you had, so you clung to it with everything you had left. The road took you through a forest on the 3rd day. Thick, dense, oppressive. Trees pressed in from both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked most of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, damp with moisture that never quite evaporated, and filled with sounds that made every hair on your body stand up. Rustling in the undergrowth, snapping twigs, the distant call of birds that sounded almost like human screams. The forest was alive in a way that open fields weren't, and that aliveness felt threatening. Forest terrified medieval people, and for very good reason. They weren't the tame, managed woodlands of modern times. They were wild, dangerous places where civilization stopped and chaos began. They were full of very real dangers. Wolves travelled in packs, hunting anything that looked weak or alone. Bears, massive and unpredictable, defended their territory violently. Wild boars, surprisingly aggressive, could gore you with their tusks if you startled them. And then there were the human dangers. Bandits lived in forests, hiding in the shadows, waiting for lone travellers to pass by so they could rob them, kill them, or both. And beyond the physical dangers were the stories. Forests were places where the devil walked, where evil spirits lurked behind trees, where witches gathered for their dark rituals. People who entered forests sometimes never came out, or they came out changed, mad, possessed. The forest was a boundary between the human world and something else, something older and darker and fundamentally hostile to human existence. You walked faster, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. You gripped your walking stick like a weapon, though you knew it would be useless against anything that actually wanted to kill you. A stick wouldn't stop a wolf. It definitely wouldn't stop a bandit with a knife. But holding it made you feel slightly less defenceless, and in the current situation, feeling was almost as important as being. The path twisted and turned, disappearing around corners where anything could be waiting. You fought the urge to run because running meant losing the path, and losing the path in a forest meant certain death. You'd wander in circles until you died of exposure or starvation, or were killed by one of the forest's many predators. So you walked, fast but controlled, trying to project confidence you absolutely didn't feel. A sound behind you made you freeze. Footsteps. Definite footsteps. Not the random rustling of wind or animals. Deliberate human footsteps. Someone was behind you on the path. Someone was following you. Your heart began to pound so hard. You could hear it in your ears. Slowly, trying not to look panicked, you glanced over your shoulder. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. But the footsteps continued, matching your pace. When you walked, they walked. When you stopped, they stopped. Someone was definitely there, definitely following, definitely staying just out of sight. Panic surged. You started walking faster. The footsteps matched your speed. You broke into a jog, then a run, abandoning all pretense of calm, just moving, stumbling over roots, branches whipping at your face, breath coming in gasps. The footsteps behind you accelerated. Closer now. Definitely closer. And then you burst out of the forest into open fields, gasping, chest-heaving, terror turning your legs to jelly. You spun around, staring at the tree line. Nothing emerged. No figure appeared. The forest stood silent, empty, as if nothing had ever been there. Whatever had been following you, if anything had actually been following you, had stopped at the forest edge. Maybe it had been real. Maybe it had been your imagination. Maybe it had been an animal tracking you. Maybe it had been a bandit who decided you weren't worth the trouble. Maybe it had been something else entirely, something the medieval mind believed in but the modern mind dismisses. You'd never know. But the terror was real, and it stayed with you for hours, a cold weight in your chest that refused to lift. You kept walking, away from the forest, into the safety of open ground where you could see threats coming. Your legs shook. Your hands trembled. You'd come very close to something, whether it was danger or just your own fear manifesting in sounds that weren't really there. Either way, you'd survived. Barely, but survived. Finally, on the late afternoon of the fourth day, you saw it in the distance. Your destination. A monastery on a hill, its stone walls catching the sunlight, its tower rising above the surrounding landscape like a beacon. Relief flooded through. You so powerfully you nearly collapsed right there on the road. You'd made it. Against every odd, through every danger. Despite hunger and exhaustion and fear and doubt, you'd actually made it. You climbed the hill, each step lighter than the last despite your exhaustion. With each step, the terror of the past few days began to lift. You'd done it. You'd left your village, travelled through unknown lands, survived rivers and forests and strange villages and your own terror, and you'd arrived at your destination. You reached the monastery gate and knocked, your hand shaking. A monk answered, his face calm and neutral, his simple brown robe clean and well-maintained, a stark contrast to your filthy, torn, exhausted appearance. You explained who you were, why you'd come, delivered whatever message or performed whatever duty had sent you on this journey in the first place. The monk nodded, stepped aside, and let you in. And with that simple gesture, your journey ended. Inside the monastery, walls, the world was quiet, peaceful, ordered. the complete opposite of everything you'd experienced on the road. You were given food, real food, warm and substantial, bread that wasn't stale, soup that steamed, even a bit of meat, a luxury you hadn't seen in weeks. You ate slowly, savouring every bite, feeling strength return to your body in ways you'd forgotten were possible. Someone showed you to a room, a small cell with a narrow bed, but it was clean and dry and safe. You lay down on that bed, still dressed in your filthy clothes, too exhausted to even remove your shoes, and for the first time in 4 days, you felt safe. That night, you slept deeply, without fear, without vigilance, without the constant awareness that danger might be approaching. You slept the sleep of someone who'd survived something they weren't sure they'd survive, and when you woke the next morning, stiff but rested, you realised something profound. You were no longer just a peasant from a village no one had heard of. You were a traveller, someone who had seen the world beyond the fields, someone who had walked through forests and crossed rivers and survived strange villages and their own terror. And though you'd never forget the fear, the hunger, the loneliness, the overwhelming sense of vulnerability and smallness in a world that was too big and too dangerous, you'd also never forget the pride. You had left your village, you had journeyed into the unknown, and you had survived. In the medieval world, where most people never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace in their entire lives, that made you extraordinary. Not heroic, perhaps, not legendary, but extraordinary in your own small, quiet way. The world was bigger than you'd ever imagined, full of dangers you'd never considered and small mercies you'd never expected. And you, somehow, against all odds, were still alive in it.